Okay?
Gotcha.
So I am at Triangle Square, where I'm happy to present my talk on history today. And I'm going to be talking about Marie Antoinette, her life and loves, and what it was like living at Versailles, where she lived before she was the last Queen of France, before the Revolution. So, and my name is Saba Borov. So Marie Antoinette was born in Austria to Maria Antonia, and she was born to the Empress Maria Theresa and Francis I, the Holy Roman Emperor. And she was born in 1755. She was married to Louis XVI when she was 14 years old. She arrived at the French court when she was 15 years old. They married young in those days. And Louis was 1 year older than she was. And it was hard for her to adapt to the French court because it was very elaborate etiquette, which she wasn't used to in Austria. And she did a lot of blunders with people, and the public turned against her. The French public hated Austria. They were an old enemy of France. That's actually why the two of them got married, because they were trying to cement relations between the two countries. But the French people hated Austria. And their wedding, they were married, and Louis XV, which was the grandfather of Louis XVI, was king at the time, and when she was 20, Louis XV died, and she and Louis XVI became Queen and King of France. And Louis XVI was homely. He was a loner. He was very socially inept. He probably had a lot of trouble with sex, and she was just the opposite. She was a social butterfly. She was very outgoing. She loved to party. She was probably a compulsive gambler, very extravagant, which is really what got her in trouble with the French people. And she was a patron of a lot of arts. The first night they were together, the whole court had to watch them have sex because they had to make sure he did his job. And they were without children for 7 years. Which was very unusual in those days, and the French public got very disgusted with them because they felt if Louis couldn't be a man in the bedroom, then what kind of king was he going to be? And they blamed it on her. In those days, they always blamed the woman if the man couldn't perform. They blamed the woman for everything. And so finally, they had her brother from Austria come in, and he watched them have sex, and then he told them what they were doing wrong, and then finally they started having children. And they had 4 children. 2 of them died very young, and I'll tell the story of what happened to the 2 that lived toward the end. But first I want to mention, in Versailles, you know, it's very glamorous, Versailles. It looks beautiful, all the costumes and the jewelry and everything, but really, it was really different than we think. There were 10,000 people living at Versailles, between all the courtiers, the royalty, the servants, the cooks, the maids, the soldiers, and they had no plumbing, no toothpaste, no laundry, no sanitation of any kind. When the ladies had to go to the bathroom in their gowns, they would lift up the gown and just pee where they stood. I mean, they had shit all over, they had rats. I mean, it was pretty awful. And actually, the French invented perfume, and all the courts in Europe were the same way. I mean, they were the same. And the French invented perfume, which we think is very glamorous, but they invented perfume because everything smelled so bad they wanted to get their noses off it. So, but anyway, it's very interesting. A little background for the French Revolution. The French people were divided into 3 or 4 states. We had the very poor, we had the bourgeoisie who paid all of the taxes. The church was very rich and powerful. They owned a lot of land. They paid no taxes, and the nobility paid no taxes. So the poor were supporting these royals in this extravagant lifestyle when the poor were starving, and they didn't have enough food, and they had terrible working conditions and no rights at all. And it's really no wonder that they revolted. And actually, it's similar to what's happening today with the very rich people not paying taxes and the average person, you know, bankrolling the government, and the rich people getting very extravagant and crazy. So that was part of the background. Also, Luis helped America in our war for independence, and without him, we probably would have lost the war, most likely. But he didn't get much out of it, and it was a big, it was a lot of money for him. And he also tried to turn the other governments in Europe away from England, because he hated England, and they were old enemies. So he was, but he went back. The French government was in very bad deficit. They called Marie Madame Deficit. They had these pamphlets, which were the fake news of the time, just like fake news today. Anybody could make a pamphlet, and they would distribute it all over France, and all the common people would read it, and they would believe whatever was in the pamphlet, even if it was completely a lie. And she became a hated figurehead of the monarchy, a symbol of the corruption of the government and the extravagance of the royalty that were living a very high life at the expense of ordinary people. And so she became a hated symbol of everything that was wrong with the monarchy. And these fake news pamphlets accused her of having affairs, and she did have affairs, and so did everybody else. And also being a lesbian, which I'm going to talk about later. And right before the revolution, about 4 years before, there was the affair of the diamond necklace, which is very famous. The prior king was trying to make a necklace for his mistress, not the queen, which was worth 2 million livres at the time, which was an enormously expensive necklace. Even for the extravagance of the king, it was extravagant. And he died before they could put this necklace together, because they had to search for lots and lots of diamonds to make this necklace. So after the king died, the jeweler wanted to sell it to Louis XVI for Marie, but she didn't want it because she hated the king's mistress, and she didn't want the necklace, so she refused it several times. So what happened was, there was a con artist, and she had an enemy who was a cardinal. And he didn't know her directly, but he was an enemy of hers. So this con artist pretended to write him letters pretending to be Marie, saying she wanted the necklace, but she had to do it secretly because it was too extravagant to do. So this con artist got this cardinal to pay some money for the necklace, and then the jeweler turned the necklace over to the con artist, who hired a prostitute to pretend to be the queen and seized the necklace, ran out and took it all apart and sold it in the black market all over Europe. And it hit the courts, and it was a big scandal, and the public was completely mesmerized by it. And the queen was completely innocent. She had nothing to do with this. It was all this con artist forging her name and signing letters, which were obviously not really written by her, but the cardinal had no way of knowing. So the con artist went to jail. She was whipped and sent to jail. The cardinal got away scot-free because, he was a cardinal. And the con artist actually broke out of jail dressed as a man and went to live outside of France. But the pamphlets said the queen was lying and behind the whole thing because she wanted to punish the cardinal, who was an enemy of hers. That isn't true at all. But the people believed it. And then she was trying to defraud the crown jewelers of the money that they were owed. So the people became enraged at the queen. This was just another nail in her coffin as far as they're concerned of how extravagant and what a crook she was. So that was another thing she did, which was completely fake news, but again, the people believed it just like they do now in the current news cycle. And that was the affair of the diamond necklace, that's what it's called. So anyway, now while we're talking here, let me get to some of her lesbian love affairs, which somebody suggested that I look up. So I did look them up. So there were 2 or 3 women in her court that she really loved, and one of them was and the public had pamphlets accusing her of being a lesbian, unfaithful to her husband. So let me look at this now. And she was already hated before the affair of the diamond necklace, but this just makes people even mad at her today, madder at her. So the 2 women that she was she may or may not have had affairs with them. We really don't know what they did in their bedroom, but she really loved these women, and she wrote them very affectionate notes. One of them was, I'm just looking up my notes here, the Princess de Lamballe. Now, she was very beautiful and very wealthy, and Marie just loved her very much, and she took her to court. She made her a favorite. She promoted her to very cushy positions. All the other nobles were jealous, of the princess. And she wrote letters to her saying, "My heart entirely yours," and "My dear heart." They have letters of her to the princess. So we don't know if she was actually having actual sex with the princess. The princess was pretty prudish, and she didn't have affairs with men particularly, but I don't know if that meant she was really a lesbian. I don't know what happened there, but that's one of the women to whom it's attributed that she may have had an affair. And unfortunately, the princess had a very bad end. When the revolution came and Marie was already in jail, they got the princess and tried her, the Robespierre and the revolutionary court, and they declared her guilty. And then he handed her to the mob, who raped her and tore limb from limb. And then they cut off her head and paraded it outside Marie, who was in jail at that time, outside her window, the princess's head, and said, and the crowd was screaming, "Give your lover one last kiss." And that was how she died. But the other woman that might have been her lover, and this was more likely, I think, to be real, was, let me get my notes here, the Duchess de Polignac. Now, I'm probably really mispronouncing this. The Duchess and her husband were nobility, but they were very poor. And Marie saw the Duchess, immediately was mesmerized by her. She was very beautiful, the Duchess, and very vivacious and outgoing. So the minute Marie saw her, she said, "Come, move to court." But it cost a fortune to live at court, because you had to keep up appearances and have gowns and servants and everything. So the Duchess said, "Well, we can't afford it." So the Queen says, "No problem, I'll pay for everything." So she made her a Duchess, which she wasn't, and then she gave her a huge amount of money, 13-room apartment at Versailles, treated her, promotions and cushy jobs and a huge amount of money. And the Duchess moved to court, and again, all the other nobles got jealous and angry that she was getting all these favors from the Queen. And the Duchess was exiled and ended up dying a natural death in Switzerland many years after the revolution. Radcliffe Halls, the very famous lesbian author who wrote The Well of Loneliness about being a lesbian, I think it was in the 50s, she mentions the Marie and Lamballe in that book. And Marie became an icon for lesbian writers, especially in the centuries after her death. And a lot of them referred to her love affairs as a lesbian love affair. So she was kind of an icon for the lesbian movement. She also had another lover, because she was probably bisexual, Axel von Fersen. He was a handsome Swedish soldier. He was at court, And we said, you know, the king is homely, he's pretty much of a slob and a loner and a little bit crazy. So she wasn't too happy having to have sex with him. But they rumored she had an affair with this guy, and he may have even fathered her children, because after 7 years, the pressure was on for them to have kids one way or another. And it's some questionable whether Louis was even the father of her children. And he actually escaped the revolution, and he lived 17 years more in Stockholm, and he was a sexually insatiable profligate himself, and he died there, and so that's what happened to him. But she was very extravagant. The famous quote, which is attributed to her to this day, is "Let them eat cake," which everybody knows, but actually she probably never said that. Yeah. That actual quote was in a book which was written before she even came to court. And it may have been spoken by some other of the royals, but probably not her, because she did care a little bit about the poor, although not that much. But more, she would not probably have said that. However, the pamphlets, the fake news, they said she said it, the people believed it, and right at that time, she's supposed to have said, "Let them eat cake," the French lived on bread. The poor people lived on bread. It was a staple of their diet. And there was a bad winter and a bad harvest, so they were really starving, and they had to pay all these taxes, and the price of bread just went up. So they were starving and angry. And when the pamphlets came out that said, Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake," I mean, it made them see red. And this is, probably fake news, but she was really a victim of fake news, even though she really was terribly extravagant, and the royals didn't really do anything for the poor people. But still, that was fake news, but it sealed her downfall. So what happened was things got worse and worse, and Marie became a symbol of the hatred of the aristocracy and their spending, which was so obscene with all these poor people. And so let's see. Now, so then the revolution started. And in 1789, a mob of women stormed the Versailles, dragged the royal family out of there, and imprisoned them in Tuileries, which is a jail. And in 1791, they tried to escape. And there were Austrians, and she's from Austria, and remember, the French hate Austria, so she had let her Austrian family know that she was trying to escape. And there were Austrian troops ready to invade France to help her. And unfortunately, this made even things worse for her, because now, on top of everything else, she was also a traitor to France and allying with one of their worst enemies. And she tried to escape, but they caught her and they dragged her back to jail. So, and they went back on the throne temporarily. And the radical French government, the Robespierre, declared war on Austria, and the war went very badly. And they all blamed the Queen on the whole thing. So the mob again threw the royal family in prison, only this time they never got out. And in 1793, Louis XVI was executed. In January, Marie was executed in October. When she was jailed, her hair went white overnight, which is a very rare thing, but it's real. It doesn't usually happen, but it did turn her hair white, the stress. And her two surviving children, she had a daughter and a son, two of her children died young, but there were two kids left. Her son, who was the heir to the throne, and he was in brutal prison conditions. He was taken away from her. They manipulated this child, who was like 10 years old, to say his mother was evil. He hated his mother. He lied that said she had incest with him. They made him say that, which probably wasn't true either, because they just wanted to convict her on every crime that they could start. So he was in prison, and he died probably of tuberculosis, because the conditions were so brutal and awful, and he was beaten and dirty and not fed properly. And the only one that lived was Maria Theresa, who was released from prison when she was 17 years old. She was the last surviving member of the family. And she married Louis the 18th, but she lived in exile from France because they weren't really allowing royalty in there. In 1830, she was named Queen of France just so Louis can abdicate the throne and turn it over to the Republican government. And she lived to be 72 in exile. So that's what happened to her family. And actually, the bourgeoisie and the lower class were really homophobic. They were really anti-gay. They viewed being gay as a German vice. That's what it was called. So she was Austrian, and that automatically meant that she was probably a lesbian to them. And they really hated gay people. So to accuse her of being a lesbian, made them even madder than they already were. And they called her Madame Deficit because, the government was bankrupt, which wasn't all her fault. But anyway, so that's the story of Marie Antoinette, and it's a very amazing story, and I hope that it was interesting listening to it, and turn that off. So I have some